I'm not a Christian. I think I remain quite thoroughly agnostic, which is one of the reasons it's quite difficult to interrogate my beliefs. But one of them would be the problem of evil.
Oh, it's the hard question for any worldview.
Because it's the obvious point. It is the argument.
Yeah.
And it's been discussed ad nauseum.
I've started to think about that fact because as a mathematician, you get problems that people have attacked for centuries and have got nowhere. And the way mathematicians react to that is that they say perhaps we're asking the wrong question.
You're about to watch 4.5 minutes of pure gold. Professor John Lennox is answering the hardest question you can be asked, and he's giving the greatest answer I have ever heard, certainly in 4.5 minutes. Alex O'Connor is the agnostic who is asking this question, and he begins by explaining where he's coming from, spiritually speaking.
I'm not a Christian, and that has a lot to do with my lack of trust in the reliability of not so much the Gospels as a whole, but particularly things like the resurrection narratives. But this team of religion is bad and evil and corrupting of thought, I'm not on that boat.
He's not with the new atheists.
Yes, well, nor am I.
And I'm also not on the boat of saying that God doesn't exist and religion is false. I'm more of an agnostic these days, but I tend to take a more critical tone because that's just sort of who I am and what I do. But I think I remain quite thoroughly agnostic, which is one of the reasons it's quite difficult to interrogate my beliefs because there are so few of them that are solidly held. But one of them would be, for example, so there's the reliability of Scripture, but when you're talking about theism as opposed to Christianity, one of them really is the problem of evil. I do find it mysterious and bewildering.
Oh, it's the hard question for any worldview.
But then
I think
one of the reasons why it actually comes up so little is because it almost feels trivial to bring up because it's the obvious point. It is the argument.
Yeah.
And it's been discussed ad nauseum.
Earlier in this fantastic discussion between Alex O'Connor and John Lennox, Alex actually says one of his favorite arguments for the existence of God is that there are so many arguments for God's existence. That might make you believe that there is a God because you can actually make an argument for God's existence out of really anything in human existence. But on the other side of the scales, there is this one question, this hardest question, and it's the problem of evil, the question of suffering, and they're completely out of time in the podcast. We're well past the 1 hour, 30-minute mark. But John Lennox is not going to let this opportunity go. He is going to give us 4.5 minutes of pure gold on the problem of evil. What I want you to notice, first of all, is that John Lennox reframes the question about suffering, and he hands back to Alex a true problem. And that is the gift that John Lennox gives to Alex O'Connor. And that's why I think this is masterful. I think this is pure gold. I have not heard 4.5 minutes that have warmed my heart so much as I have when John Lennox reframes the question and hands it back to Alex to say, you are right to have this problem. Let's have this problem together. Let's watch John Lennox.
I will say one thing about it, because whenever this comes up, it often comes up in terms whether people who are discussing it realize it or not, to go back a long way to people like Lucretius and so on. Surely a good God, an all-powerful God should, etc., do this or that. And I've reflected on that a lot because we've all had endless arguments like that have never come to a satisfactory conclusion.
Right.
And I've started to think about that fact. Because as a mathematician, you get problems that people have attacked for centuries and have got nowhere. And the way mathematicians react to that is that they say perhaps we're asking the wrong question. And I think I found that helpful in the following way. And I'll be brief. It's this, that what faces everybody is a mixed picture. I call it beauty and bombs. In other words, we look at the world, we see some beautiful things and we see some horrible things, especially these days. And any worldview has got to take that into account. That is a fact. And we can argue as long as we like about the theoretical side. If God is good and all-powerful, why this and why that, why the other? And we never come to a satisfactory answer. So I propose another question, equally difficult, but I think it gets us a bit further. Granted that it's like that, is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God who understands it, and to such an extent that I can feel, not that I've got an answer, but that I can see there's a possibility of coming to some peace about it? And my answer to that is that yes, I think there is. And it's the fact that the God presented in the Christian Gospels is a God who in that sense has suffered, because the central claim of Christianity is that God became human and that Christ is God. So, crudely put, what is God doing on a cross? Well, one thing it certainly shows me is that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has become part of it. And the very interesting thing, Alex, is that in 2011, I arrived in New Zealand 3 days after the earthquake, and I had to meet people who were really going through grief and so on. And I talked in those terms. And I'll never forget when I'd finished talking to the largest congregation this particular place has ever seen, I think, there was a little piece of paper pushed into my hand that said, I lost my husband in the earthquake. And what you said about the cross has given me the first glimmer of hope. And it ties together something you said just a few minutes ago, which I'd love to discuss in detail, but it would have to be another time. If the cross were the end, we'd never have heard of Jesus. And so for me, the resurrection becomes the central thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what the apostles preached. It's what Jesus claimed. It's evidence that he was who he claimed to be. And it has those two dimensions. It has the intellectual dimension. How can you possibly believe that Jesus rose from the dead when we know the laws of nature? Hume. And secondly, what is the evidence in terms of personal experience of encounter with Christ who is alive? So that would be possibly a discussion for another time.
Yes, I think so.
Did you notice how he handed back to Alex the question? And he handed back to Alex a question that Alex is meant to wrestle with. He has not answered or dissolved the problem of evil. He has given back to Alex the true problem, which is so important with the problem of evil. I think the real trick with the problem of evil is to make sure that you've got a problem with it. The real issue would be if you did not have a problem with evil. And John Lennox is insisting that there is such a thing as beauty and bombs. And I think on a materialist framework, if matter in motion is all there is, then both sides of those things are undercut massively. Is there such a thing as beauty in a materialist frame? Is there such a thing as evil with a capital E in a materialist frame? And John Lennox is insisting that there is a problem. And I think it's actually important with agnostics like Alex to insist that there is a problem, because the danger of the sort of atheism that Alex has been a proponent of is that you do not have a problem with evil. And we need to present the problem as a problem, not simply that we are maladapted for survival, not simply that we have experiences that are grotesque or painful, but that there are things that are wrong. You know, the New Zealand earthquake was wrong. John Lennox is not going to offer, reasons X, Y, and Z that prove why suffering is justified in this world. I think that would be a non-Christian answer. That would be an utterly pagan answer. What John Lennox wants to do is to affirm the reality of beauty and bombs. And notice how John Lennox did that with such pathos and ethos and logos. And you'll know from Aristotle that is what rhetoric consists in. You need the ethos of a person who has been there and done that, a person who is qualified to speak about an issue, not just because of their expertise, but because of their ethics. And John Lennox has been establishing his ethos over an entire career of standing firmly for Christian truth and living with integrity. And throughout this hour-and-a-half conversation, he has demonstrated ethos. In this answer, he demonstrates ethos. He's the sort of person who can be listened to and trusted. He's also demonstrated logos. He is Professor John Lennox. He is this mathematician of some note. And again, for the last 90 minutes, he has been demonstrating that faith and reason are not at loggerheads with one another. He has demonstrated both the ethos and the logos, but really it's the pathos here that really communicates with Alex. Alex, ethically speaking, in terms of his meta-ethics, what he thinks determines what's right and wrong, he's an emotivist. He thinks we are driven by our passions, and there's something quite biblical about that. We are heart-driven creatures, according to the Bible. And John Lennox meets him there with the God who has entered into suffering, who has plumbed our depths at the cross. And John Lennox cannot believe in, and I cannot believe in, a God who remains distant from suffering. But actually, the God of the cross cannot be disproved by suffering, because here we have the God who has entered into suffering and who affirms suffering as exactly what we feel it to be. Alex feels it to be, I feel it to be, John Lennox feels it to be, you feel it to be wrong. Wrong with a capital W. But then he rises again to prove that there is something above nature, something that is right with a capital R. And I love that little argument for the resurrection, just thrown in half a sentence. He says, well, if Jesus hadn't risen again, we would never have heard of him. And the resurrection of the crucified one brings together these existential issues, the pathos issues, as well as the logos issues, the historicity, the facticity of Jesus rising from the dead. John Lennox accomplishes all of that, throwing in stories about Northern Ireland, throwing in stories about New Zealand, throwing in his experience as a mathematician. He bundles it all up in a little bow in 4.5 minutes. And this is, I think, the greatest answer to the question of suffering that there can be, not by dissolving away the problem of suffering, but by handing back the problem to Alex and saying, you're right, it really is a problem. And let me give you the story in which the problem makes sense and into which Christ enters as friend and Lord and victor over suffering. And if you want to explore the emotional sense that Jesus makes to all of life, why don't you go to 321course.com. It's our introduction to the Christian faith. It costs you absolutely nothing. You just give us your email address and that gets you into our online learning platform where it'll save your progress, give you a whole bunch of other resources. And in 2 hours, you can binge the whole thing, or over the course of 8 different sessions, you can see life according to Jesus. Go to 321course.com. We'd love you to see that. I don't know what you think. On our channel, we've spoken to John Lennox. We've done lots of videos about Alex O'Connor. I think there might be a conversation with Alex in the works between me and him. I'd love to talk to him more about this kind of stuff. If you want to catch up with all of our stuff here at Speak Life, why don't you subscribe and tap that bell, and we'll see you on the next video.